Hi, friend. I came across incredible historical photographs that are really capable of surprising. These are real shots, and now I'm going to tell you the story of each one. The Cypress Freeway collapsed in the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. The disaster exposed a major design weakness and changed how California built roads in quake zones. This is the crash site where Carole Lombard died in 1942 while returning from a war bond tour. Her wedding ring stayed hidden on Potosi Mountain for more than 80 years before it was finally found in 2023. Joe Metheny was arrested in Baltimore in 1996 after a failed attack that ended his run from police. He later claimed his roadside food stand hid a dark secret that still makes this case infamous. Fred Hampton was killed in the Chicago raid in 1969 while he lay in bed. Police fired nearly 100 shots, and investigators later found the Panthers fired just one. Rudolf Höss ran Auschwitz, where more than 1 million people were sent to their deaths. He was later captured and executed in 1947 at the same camp. In 1976, a cable car in Cavallese fell about 200 meters after a support cable snapped. 43 people died, and only one passenger, 14-year-old Alessandra Piovesan, survived. An Inuit hunter in the Canadian Arctic displays a year's catch of Arctic foxes in this Richard Harrington photo from the late 1940s or early 1950s. United States Marines inspect a wrecked Japanese H-8K flying boat on Saipan in July 1944. This giant seaplane was one of Japan's longest-range aircraft, built to strike from vast distances across the Pacific. Paul Tibbets and Thomas Farabee sit again in the Enola Gay cockpit in 1981, decades after their mission over Hiroshima. Their flight changed warfare forever and opened the nuclear age. Robert Goddard stands beside his rocket in Massachusetts, just days before the first successful liquid-fueled launch in history. On March 16, 1926, that small machine opened the space age. Pope John Paul II rides in a Ferrari in 1988, one of the strangest mixes of faith and speed ever photographed. The moment felt so unusual because the Vatican is usually linked with modest cars, not Italy's most famous sports machine. A Japanese bomber crew loads bombs in Hunan in September 1944 before a mission over China. The writing on one bomb reads like a personal message to Chiang Kai-shek. After the Port Arthur massacre in 1996, Australia collected and destroyed about 650,000 firearms. The country changed its gun laws within weeks, making this one of the fastest major responses to a mass shooting. This main mailbox was built high and far out to survive snowplows in the 1960s. In deep winter, even getting the mail took engineering. Fans at the Beatles' first American concert in Washington in 1964 react like they are watching history explode in real time. That night helped launch Beatlemania across the United States. Art Rothschild rides his wild four-man bicycle in 1948, a machine driven by 5 chains and pure nerve. He broke 3 ribs learning to control it, which says almost everything about this strange invention. This campaign car from Italy in 1958 looks like a tiny spaceship on wheels built for election season. The fake Sputnik on top turned Cold War style into street propaganda. Civilians at a civil rights march in Derry are forced against a wall during Bloody Sunday in 1972. British soldiers shot 27 unarmed people that day, killing 14 and leaving one of Northern Ireland's darkest images. Piles of glasses found at Auschwitz showed how many lives were stripped down to objects. When Soviet troops entered the camp in 1945, scenes like this exposed the scale of Nazi cruelty. The Apollo 1 crew crosses the access arm on January 27, 1967, in one of their last photos before launch rehearsal. Just hours later, a cabin fire turned this ordinary walk into one of the most haunting images in space history. A London skinhead is led away by police in 1980 with "Made in London" tattooed across his shaved scalp. John Downing's photo captured the hard edge of a youth scene Britain could not ignore. Emerson Fittipaldi poses with his Indy 500 winning car in 1989 beside a $1 million cash prize. It became one of racing's most famous victory photos because the money looked almost unreal. A runaway locomotive crashed past Concord's giant turntable in 1890, turning a routine rail maneuver into chaos. One wrong move was enough to leave a full steam engine hanging over the pit. Masked figures moved through a Sicilian Easter procession in 1993, turning the street into something ancient and unsettling. Josef Koudelka caught the moment where faith, ritual, and mystery all looked like one thing. A Black Panther member peers from behind a door ripped by police gunfire after a pre-dawn raid in about 1969. The flyer beside him offers free breakfast for children, making the scene feel even more jarring. Jacques-Henri Lartigue photographed his brother in a tire boat at Château de Rouzat in 1911. This image later became one of the early visual references people linked to Wes Anderson's style. Reed Blackburn's car was found half-buried after the Mount St. Helens eruption on May 18, 1980. He was inside, even though he had been more than 7 miles from the blast. Harold Harmsworth met Adolf Hitler at Berchtesgaden in January 1937. Through the Daily Mail, he later backed appeasement and even praised Nazi expansion in Europe. A man protests dress hems in 1962, demanding laws against skirts that showed knees while seated. Just a few years later, the miniskirt exploded in popularity and made signs like this look instantly outdated. Evicted sharecroppers line Highway 60 in New Madrid County, Missouri, with their belongings piled beside the road in 1944. The photo exposed how families could lose both their homes and their crops in a single blow. A bomb addressed to Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt was displayed at New York Central Post Office in April 1929. Postal worker Thomas Callagy later admitted he planted it himself in hopes of earning a promotion. David Hammonds sold snowballs on a New York street in 1983 as an unannounced performance called Blizzard Ball Sale. It later became one of his most influential works, built from almost no documentation and a simple idea about value. A group of young studio hopefuls pose in this Felipe Halsman photo from 1948 or 1949. Marilyn Monroe is front center, years before she became one of the most famous faces in the world. Pan Am Flight 103 broke apart over Lockerbie in 1988 after a bomb exploded on board. All 259 people on the plane died, along with 11 people on the ground. Karl Wallenda walks a tightrope high above a packed stadium in Philadelphia in August 1972. He was 67 years old and even did a headstand halfway across. A closed church in Russia was turned into a grain store in 1930. The photo shows how the Soviet state stripped religious spaces of their original purpose. Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard in Baltimore was part of America's huge shipbuilding surge in 1941. Yards like this helped turn out Liberty ships at a pace that stunned the world. This Chicago Tribune chart from 1900 ranked the everyday objects women most often used in assaults. Broom handles, knives, and rolling pins topped the list, turning household tools into crime statistics. An orchard crew poses in a bare tree in the early 1900s, turning farm labor into a human tower. The photo captured how seasonal fruit work once depended almost entirely on ladders, balance, and manpower. A face peers through a sealed doorway in a ghetto building marked for typhus quarantine in early 1941. The sign banned both entry and exit, showing how disease control and isolation were used inside Nazi-occupied Poland. In 1976, 26 children and their bus driver were hidden in this buried trailer at a quarry in California. They survived for 16 hours underground before escaping through the roof. This railroad car was prepared for Abraham Lincoln's casket in 1865 after his assassination. It had already carried his son Willie 3 years earlier, giving the car a second and even darker place in Lincoln family history. A NASA rover captured this view of Mars from more than 200 million miles away from Earth. The image crossed deep space by radio signal, giving us a real photo from another world. Jan Armstrong and her sons watched Neil Armstrong leave Earth on July 16, 1969. While they stood on a boat and looked on, he was beginning the mission that would make him the first man to walk on the moon. Young John F. Kennedy holds a snake in Palm Beach in 1936 with his sister Rosemary behind him. The photo shows the future president long before war, politics, and the White House made him world famous. French soldiers stand in a trench at Verdun in 1916, wearing crude masks against poison gas. The battle lasted 10 months and became one of the longest and most devastating fights of the First World War. A farmer near Walsh, Colorado cut this sweeping pattern during the Dust Bowl to hold soil in place. Margaret Bourke White photographed how even the land had to be engineered to survive. A Soviet partisan in German-occupied territory in 1944 carries a German machine gun, grenades, and a belt packed with captured weapons. Partisan units behind the front often fought with whatever they could seize. American schoolchildren in the 1930s are reciting the Pledge of Allegiance with the Bellamy Salute, a gesture once used across United States classrooms before it was changed during the Second World War. Unemployed men marched through Times Square in 1930 wearing signs that list their trades and offering to work for $1 a week. The photo turns the Great Depression into one brutal fact. Skilled workers stood in the street advertising themselves like moving job posters. Joseph Pilates guides opera star Roberta Peters through one of his control-based training exercises in 1951. His method began in the early 20th century and later grew into one of the most famous fitness systems in the world. The Dempsey and Carpentier fight in 1921 drew such a huge crowd that the ring looked like a tiny white dot inside a human sea. It became the first boxing match to bring in more than $1 million at the gate. Soviet cosmonauts Georgy Beregovoy and Pavel Popovich present Neil Armstrong with a hunting rifle during a visit in 1970. The moment feels surreal now because the first man on the moon was being handed a gift meant, as Beregovoy joked, for hunting on Earth and not on the moon. Raleigh Free flattened himself across his motorcycle at Bonneville in 1948 to slice through the air and set a new world speed record. It proved that less wind meant more speed. A newly married couple in New Hampshire posed beside a car covered with playful wedding signs in 1958. One note on the back turns the whole photo into a joke, promising that the bride was taken in the morning but would be won back by night. Mickey Mantle flips his helmet away after a bad at-bat at Yankee Stadium in 1965. Even baseball legends looked painfully human in moments like this. Marilyn Monroe greets American troops in Korea in 1954 in a candid photo taken by a soldier. For many men far from home, her visit became one of the brightest memories of their entire deployment. Sir Malcolm Campbell stands beside the Bluebird in 1933, a machine that later became the first car to break 300 miles per hour. Its long body and hidden wheels were built to fight air itself on the empty salt flats. Velma Barfield sits in her cell at Central Prison in Raleigh in 1984, surrounded by the plain routine of prison life. Months later, she became the first woman executed in the United States after the death penalty returned. Behind the scenes on The Godfather in 1971, Marlon Brando stands beside Francis Ford Coppola as a wounded scene is prepared. Photos like this feel so powerful because they show a film legend being built in ordinary quiet moments. King George V's royal hunt in Nepal in 1911 left rows of tiger skins hanging like a wall of trophies. In just 10 days, the expedition killed dozens of tigers and rhinoceroses with the help of about 12,000 people. A United States Marine smiles in a foxhole on Iwo Jima in 1945 while reading a letter from home. In one frame, one of the hardest Pacific battles suddenly feels deeply personal. Neil Armstrong pauses to fish in Iceland during NASA training in 1967, just 2 years before walking on the moon. Even future moonwalkers spent part of their mission prep in some of the wildest places on Earth. Students at Augustana College react to the not guilty verdict in the O.J. Simpson murder trial on October 3, 1995. People were shocked because it was one of the most famous and divisive trials in America. Robert Mitchum sits in a jail cell in 1949 after his arrest for marijuana possession, a scandal that stunned Hollywood at the time. The strange twist is that he later joked he liked the prison farm, calling it Palm Springs without the riff-raff. John DeLorean stands behind a suitcase packed with cocaine during a federal press conference in 1982. The case became huge because the famous car designer later escaped conviction by arguing he had been set up through entrapment. 19-year-old Matthias Rust stands by his small Cessna on Red Square in 1987 after flying straight through Soviet air defenses and landing beside the Kremlin. The stunt shocked the world because one teenager exposed a giant hole in one of the most heavily guarded skies on Earth. A model in Schenectady, New York, has her cigarette lit in 1948 by a remote manipulator built for handling radioactive materials. The photo feels unreal because a machine made for dangerous lab work is being used for a casual smoke. 9 Titanic survivors met again in 1987, 75 years after the ship went down. They had boarded as children in 1912 and returned as elderly witnesses to one of history's most famous disasters. Bruce Mozart turned Silver Springs in the 1940s into a strange underwater photo studio where even lawn mowing became a scene. His images looked playful and impossible, which is why they still feel so memorable today. Bob Dylan sits behind the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee office in Greenwood, Mississippi in 1963, playing guitar during the Civil Rights Movement. The photo matters because Dylan was not on a concert stage here. United States Navy aviator Marion Myers tests the Mark IV suit in 1959 while sealed inside a wall of ice to mimic the brutal cold of high-altitude flight. The suit was built to keep pilots alive in temperatures that could turn the sky deadly. Frank Sinatra relaxes with his dog Ringo in Palm Springs in 1965 with a giant bowl of cigarette packs on the table. One small detail in the room says a lot about the era, when constant smoking looked completely normal, even in a star's home. Margaret Gibb receives a kiss from her fiancé, while her conjoined sister Mary sits beside them in a California photo from the 1940s. The image captures a rare and deeply personal moment from the shared daily life of conjoined twins. Finnish personnel carefully disarm a floating sea mine from a tiny wooden rowboat near Hapasari in autumn 1944. The photo feels almost unbelievable because one wrong move could turn that quiet water into chaos. Dennis Rader does the hokey pokey at a wedding in the early 1990s, looking like an ordinary guest in a family photo. The image feels chilling now because he was later identified as BTK, one of the most notorious criminals in Kansas history. Camille Janazzi sits in La Jamais Contente in France in 1899, the first car to pass 100 kilometers per hour. It was electric, which makes this speed record feel far ahead of its time. Members of the 101st Airborne use bayonets to force back segregationist protesters in Little Rock in 1957. The scene shows how the fight over school integration had become so explosive that federal troops were sent to enforce the law. Teenage boys work on a 1927 Ford Model T in Des Moines in 1945 during an initiation for a local group. The giant letter on their pants looks strange today because the group name meant something very different at the time. The first Volkswagen Beetles leave Wolfsburg by train in the 1940s, still carrying their early split rear windows. This is the moment a tiny German car began its rise into one of the most recognizable vehicles in history. The Japanese cruiser Kashi sinks in the China Sea in January 1945 after torpedo hits from United States carrier aircraft. The photo catches the final moments of a warship already slipping beneath the water. Silent film star Dolores Costello poses in 1928 with the elegance that made her one of Hollywood's great early screen faces. She later became part of a famous acting family as the grandmother of Drew Barrymore. Ava Kochever, also known as Eve Adams, appears here in 1941 after becoming one of the earliest writers to publish openly about lesbian life in America. Her story ended in Auschwitz in 1943. Participants in the Bulgarian Kukeri ritual wear huge fur costumes to scare away evil spirits and protect the next harvest. The tradition is ancient, pagan in origin, and still looks almost otherworldly today. Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck smile here before their execution in 1951 after becoming known as the Lonely Hearts Killers. They used newspaper personal ads to lure victims, which made the case one of the most infamous crime stories of its time. Italian infantry crawl uphill toward Greek positions during the Battle of Height 731 in March 1941. The ground was so devastated that the whole hillside looked stripped bare before the attack even reached the top. Austro-Hungarian soldiers of the 3rd Innsbruck Battalion pose on the Italian front on June 22, 1917. The older bearded fighter beside the younger soldier makes the war feel even harsher because whole generations were pulled into the same mountain front. German Field Marshal August von Mackensen is photographed around 1915 at age 66 in the full style of the old Prussian cavalry world. He lived long enough to see the fall of Imperial Germany and died in 1945 at age 95. Henry Bolson was a well-known American sideshow performer born with a condition that left his legs withered from birth. He built a career out of strength and acrobatic acts, turning a body others stared at into his livelihood. Royal Italian Army Bersaglieri soldiers man a Swiss-made Solothurn anti-tank rifle in North Africa during the Desert War. The long weapon and open ground show how crews had to face armored targets with almost no cover at all. A reporter looking into Mary Dufour's obituary in 1978 uncovered evidence that she was actually Anna Muriel Sizer. The discovery pointed to a family secret kept for 50 years after she was left in institutions and nearly erased from her own identity. Mary Ann Carson was a famous strongwoman who stunned crowds with extreme lifting feats and spoke openly for women's rights. Her story stands out even more because she used public fame to defend abuse survivors at a time when almost no one did. 2 South African soldiers share a light near frozen Beaumont Hamel in December 1916. In the middle of the Western Front, even a tiny flame could look like relief. This is the last known photo of John Belushi, taken in 1982 at the wedding reception of Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman. He died at just 33, which makes the image feel like the final quiet moment before a sudden loss. Steve McQueen meets Elton John and his band on the set of The Getaway in 1972 in a rare crossover of film and rock fame. One photo suddenly puts 2 different legends in the same dusty moment. In December 1961, the Beatles played Aldershot to a room so empty that only about 18 people came. The photo is amazing because one of the biggest bands in history is almost invisible at the far end of a half-empty hall. At the annual Midwest Fleege Chi Oil in Chicago in 1977, musicians turned a school hallway into a live practice room for Irish traditional music. Scenes like this show how an entire tradition was kept alive in the most ordinary corners of the city. Countess Alice de Janzé poses with her lion cub Samson around 1930 in colonial Kenya. She belonged to the Happy Valley set, a rich circle whose glamorous image hid a world of scandal and personal ruin. This is one of the last photos of Bon Scott, taken with Pete Way on February 18, 1980. He died later that night, turning a casual backstage moment into the final image of one of rock's most unforgettable voices. Georgian soldiers pose with a bust of Lenin in Sukhumi in 1992 during the war in Abkhazia. The image captures a brutal post-Soviet moment when old symbols were collapsing as new conflicts were exploding. Al Pacino appears here in 1971 while researching The Godfather with people tied to the real underworld around New York. The photo feels wild because a future screen gangster is sitting beside a man who later vanished for good. In 1964, the Yardbirds played in Lord Willis's back garden after he attacked pop music in the House of Lords. The scene is amazing because Eric Clapton and the band were basically giving a private trial performance to win over one skeptical aristocrat. Elvis wore a Denver police dress uniform at this January 28, 1976 funeral after being named an honorary police captain by the department. He came to honor Officer Larry Schmelzel, whose death deeply affected the Denver police. Twin stars Alice and Ellen Kessler posed in perfect symmetry by the Eiffel Tower in 1956, turning a Paris street into a stage. The German sisters became one of Europe's most famous duos because they sang, danced. This stiff polar bear helped promote Fanta in Germany after the drink was created in 1940 when Coca-Cola's local branch lost access to American syrup during the war. This San Francisco booking photo was taken on November 17, 1942, after performer Tanya Williams appeared at the Melody Lane Club wearing only high heels on stage. It captures how Vice Police in that era treated nightclub acts as public scandal. J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde Tolson were photographed fishing together in the 1930s. Far from the public image Hoover carefully built as the face of the FBI. Brassai captured this crowded scene at Le Monocle in Montparnasse in 1932, one of Paris's most famous night spots for women who loved women. Homer Sykes captured this Notting Hill scene in 1977 as one man supported his partner after a street attack and theft. The photo shows how public life could turn cruel in seconds for gay couples in London, even in a city famous for freedom. Rocky Marciano was 27 when this 1950 photo showed him at home eating pasta and bread served by his mother, Pasqualina Picciuto Marchigiano. Just before becoming heavyweight champion, he still looked less like a future sports legend. Henry Rollins, Joe Strummer, Rick Rubin, and Johnny Cash stood together backstage at the Pantages Theater in Los Angeles in 1995. Buster Keaton and Boris Karloff turned a 1940 charity baseball game into pure theater, with Karloff playing Frankenstein's monster right on the field. He wore glasses to see the ball, then took them off and stomped around the bases while players pretended to faint around him. Oscar Zeta Acosta Fierro was photographed after Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas made him famous, turning a real lawyer and activist into one of the wildest figures linked to the book. In May 1974, he vanished at just 39. New York subway riders sat in unusual silence during the 1953 newspaper strike, with almost no one hiding behind a paper. The photo turns an ordinary train car into something strangely bare, showing how deeply newspapers shaped daily life in that era. Al Capone stood here with his wife May and their grandchildren in Miami in 1946, looking more like a family man than one of America's most feared crime bosses. He died the next year at just 48, ending a life that had already slipped far from the power. London lay in ruins after a German air raid in 1940, yet the Old Bailey still stood in the middle of the smoke with Lady Justice above it. The photo feels unreal because one of the city's most important courts rises out of a landscape that looks almost erased. John Lennon and Yoko Ono posed by the Great Sphinx and the Pyramid of Khafre in Giza on January 22, 1979, mixing one of the world's most famous couples with one of its oldest landscapes. John Candy, Tom Hanks, and Eugene Levy gathered around Daryl Hannah in 1984 while movie magic turned her into a mermaid for Splash. The photo is great because a fantasy film looks completely ordinary behind the scenes. The Clash and Bo Diddley met backstage in Cleveland on February 13, 1979, after Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon personally asked for him to open the show. The mix feels electric because punk heroes ended up touring with a rock. Frank Costello sat on the diving board at Al Capone's Florida home in 1929, a quiet photo of a man who would become one of the most powerful mafia figures in America. These Chapman High School girls posed with their preserved food in 1917 as part of a school canning club in Kansas. Canning clubs taught students how to save food for winter and waste less at home. Joe Colombo's bodyguards grabbed the wrong man in the chaos just seconds after Colombo was attacked at his Italian Unity Day rally on June 28, 1971. Colombo survived, but spent the rest of his life paralyzed after the attack. Mods filled the South End seafront with scooters during the August bank holiday in 1978. The mod scene turned sharp clothes, soul music, and Italian scooters into one of Britain's most recognizable youth cultures. Stephen and Viola Armstrong watched their son Neil Armstrong land on the moon on July 20, 1969. This is the family of the first man to walk on the moon, seeing that moment happen live. Black debutantes stand together here in a tradition that has been part of middle and upper-class Black American life since the Ethiopian Ball in New York in 1778. These events celebrated education, family legacy, and the move into adulthood. Vincent Price handed Dodger dogs through the crowd at Dodger Stadium in 1965, where he held season tickets and watched games like any devoted fan. Johnny Cash and Dolly Parton posed backstage in 1967, the same year Dolly launched her solo career with Hello, I'm Dolly. She was just starting out on her own while Cash was already one of country music's biggest stars. A 7-month-old baby is presented at a Ku Klux Klan ceremony on Long Island in 1927. The image shows how the group tried to turn even family rituals into public loyalty displays across generations. Bum Farto stands outside his Key West fire station in the middle 1960s, years before his name became one of the city's strangest scandals. After his 1976 conviction, he vanished instead of facing a long prison sentence and was never seen again. Princess Diana smiles here while being photographed by 7-year-old Prince William in 1989. It is a rare home moment with a future king behind the camera and his mother in front of it. A demonstrator is seized by police in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 during the civil rights struggle. Birmingham became one of the movement's defining battlegrounds that year as protest images like this reached the whole country. Coco Chanel hunted near Dieppe with Winston Churchill and his son Randolph in 1928. During the Second World War, Chanel later worked for Germany as an agent under the code name Westminster. Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught and Strathern, posed in costume in 1874, looking more like a stage figure than a royal prince. He was Queen Victoria's 7th child and her 3rd son. A 7-month-old baby is held during a Ku Klux Klan ceremony on Long Island in 1927. The photo shows how the group pushed its beliefs into family life from the very start. 2 East German families built their own hot air balloon in 1979 and escaped over the border with no real shelter in the basket. They flew for 28 minutes in freezing air and landed about 6 miles inside West Germany. A United States Navy blimp hangs over a United Nations convoy in the Atlantic in 1943, scanning the sea from above while cargo ships move below. Blimps were used to spot submarines and protect convoys. Mal Evans gives George Harrison a piggyback here, a warm snapshot of the Beatles' towering road manager, fixer, and closest helper. On January 4, 1976, Evans was killed by Los Angeles police, ending the life of one of the band's most trusted behind-the-scenes figures. Adam West, dressed as Batman, walked with children in London on August 8, 1967, while filming a road safety spot. The film was made to teach British kids safe street crossing, so even Batman spent the day doing curb drill instead of fighting villains. A masked man walked through Tehran with a revolver during the Islamic Revolution in 1979, when the city was filled with street unrest and collapsing state control. Gertrude Doobie Blom captured this Maya woman in the early 1980s for The Face of the Maya, a book built from years of close work in Chiapas. Her portraits became powerful because they showed indigenous people as real individuals, not museum subjects. A masked man walked through Tehran with a revolver during the Islamic Revolution in 1979, when armed groups and street clashes reshaped the city. The image captures how fast daily life in Iran turned into open unrest as the old order collapsed. Convicted men stand here in Florida around 1903 while leased out for timber work under the Southern convict labor system. After slavery ended, states used arrests and prison sentences to push many black Americans back into forced labor under another name. Anne Frank skated with her friends in Amsterdam's Vondelpark in the winter of 1941, still part of ordinary city life for a little longer. Just months later, Jews were banned from public parks. Neil Young and Dennis Hopper stand on the set of Human Highway, the strange film they worked on together before its 1982 release. The movie took years to make and mixed comedy, music, and nuclear age fear into one very unusual project. W. Wilson Goode flashes a victory sign after voting in Philadelphia's 1983 mayoral election. He became the city's first black mayor. A Scottish Highlander and Indian Dogra soldiers sit together in a trench in France in August 1915 during the First World War. The photo shows troops from Britain and colonial India serving side by side on the Western Front. Members of the Bluebell dancing troupe demonstrated hip slimming machines in a Paris beauty salon in 1965. The photo shows how beauty culture in that era sold electric machines as a fast way to reshape the body. London children evacuated during the Second World War run back into their parents' arms after returning home. Millions of children were sent away from cities during the war, so reunions like this became some of the era's most emotional scenes. Victor Hugo appears older and heavier in each portrait, carrying the face of a man who outlived revolution, exile, and fame. He wrote Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame, then became such a giant in France that millions honored him after his death. Dolores Lebrun is taken away after the 1954 attack inside the United States Capitol, one of the most dramatic Puerto Rican nationalist actions ever photographed. She and 3 others fired from the visitors' gallery and wounded 5 members of Congress. Sikh custodians display sacred weapons linked to Guru Gobind Singh during a Shastar Darshan ceremony at Takht Sri Keshgar Sahib in Anandpur Sahib. These blades and spears are preserved as symbols of faith, memory, and the warrior tradition within Sikh history. An East End exterminator stands with his hand-painted sign in late 19th century London, selling his services right in the street. His board promises mass destruction of bugs, fleas, flies, and cockroaches in the blunt sales language of the era. Gypsy Rose Lee poses at right with fellow burlesque dancers beside a Rolls-Royce and a Curves Ahead sign around 1957. She was already one of the most famous burlesque stars in America and helped turn striptease into mainstream stage entertainment. Margaret Thatcher irons clothes at her Chelsea home in 1975, just months after becoming leader of the Conservative Party. 4 years later, she became Britain's first woman prime minister. Oswald Mosley poses in Florida in February 1926 with his wife and Franklin D. Roosevelt, years before his name became tied to British fascism. At this point, he had already broken with the Conservatives, but had not yet become the extremist figure he would later be known as. Paul McCartney is escorted out in Japan in 1980 after officials found cannabis in his luggage. He spent 10 days in jail and was then deported instead of facing a much longer sentence. Heinrich Himmler is shown exercising at the SS Officers' School in Bad Tolz in 1935, trying to project the physical ideal the SS demanded from its recruits. Bootlegger legs. Diamond is seen here on the day he was finally killed in 1931 after surviving years of ambushes and bullet wounds. By the time he died, he had already lived through 4 murder attempts, 12 bullets, and more than 70 shotgun pellets. Trafalgar Square froze into traffic chaos during the brutal winter of 1946 to 1947, when snow and ice jammed one of London's busiest junctions at rush hour. Britain was still under rationing even after the war. Elvis adjusts the robe he gave Muhammad Ali before Ali's fight with Joe Bugner on February 14, 1973. Two giants from different worlds met backstage that night, with the king of rock and roll dressing the man who called himself the greatest. Jimmy Carter watches Egyptian star Nagwa Fouad perform in Egypt in 1979 after the Camp David peace deal reshaped the region. The photo catches a rare moment when high politics and Cairo nightlife ended up in the same room. Australian airmen carried the Red Baron to his grave in northern France after he was shot down on April 21, 1918. The enemy who recovered him respected him enough to give him a full military funeral. This Gestapo mugshot shows Sophie Scholl at 21 after she and her brother Hans spread leaflets at the University of Munich calling on Germans to resist Nazi rule. She was executed in 1943. Syd Barrett stretches out on his 1959 Pontiac Parisienne in London in 1969, looking perfectly at home on a car he reportedly could not properly drive. The photo fits him almost too well because even his huge American car came with a strange. French veteran Georges Roy married Marguerite Lavenu in Paris after the war left him without his eyes and arms. She came from his village in Normandy and offered to marry him in 1917 after hearing what had happened to him. Paul Pavlik is shown after his 1960 arrest for allegedly planning to hit John F. Kennedy with a car packed with explosives in Palm Beach. The plot was stopped before it happened. Irma Gracie stands here with Josef Kramer in one of the most infamous images linked to the camp system of the Second World War. She was 22 when she was executed in 1945 after being convicted for her crimes against prisoners at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. 17-year-old Randy Gardner is examined in 1964 during the famous experiment in which he stayed awake for 11 days and 25 minutes. The test was closely watched by sleep researcher William C. Dement and Navy Dr. John J. Ross as his body. Charles Durning stands here in uniform in 1942, years before he became a celebrated actor on stage and screen. He later survived D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, earning the Silver Star, Bronze Star, and 3 Purple Hearts. Wreckage from Otis Redding's plane is pulled from the water in Wisconsin in 1967, just days after he recorded Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. He was only 26 when the crash killed him and 4 members of his band. Frank Sinatra Jr. is seen here just after his release on December 11, 1963, with his mother holding him close. The men who took him had first considered Bob Hope's son, then dropped that idea as too un-American. Benito Mussolini poses bare-chested in the snow at Monte Terminiglio around 1937 during a staged winter outing in Italy. Photos like this were used to sell an image of strength and toughness around the fascist leader. Sailors dance on the USS Recruit in Union Square in 1917, a fake battleship built by the Navy in the middle of New York City. It was used to recruit seamen and sell Liberty bonds while crowds watched military life from the street. Jörg Knöfel caught an East Berlin punk sitting beside a Volkspolizei officer, each staring away as if the other did not exist. The punk was Sven Marquardt, who later became one of Berlin's most famous faces as the man on the door at Berghain. Jonathan Schmitz appears in court in 1995 after killing Scott Amador, soon after they both appeared on The Jenny Jones Show. The case became one of the most notorious talk show scandals of the decade because a studio surprise was followed by a real murder. Elvis talks with Rodney Dangerfield in Las Vegas in 1969, while Colonel Tom Parker stands beside them in one of his famously loud custom suits. Neil Armstrong and Valentina Tereshkova stand together in Star City, Moscow in 1970, the first man on the moon beside the first woman in space. Few photos bring the space race into one frame this perfectly. Apollo 13 astronauts James Lovell, Fred Hayes, and John Swigert are seen safe after splashdown in the Pacific. Their damaged mission swung around the moon and carried them farther from Earth than any humans had ever traveled. President Lyndon Johnson visited Dwight Eisenhower at Walter Reed in 1968 after Eisenhower suffered his 7th heart attack. It brought together the sitting president and the former Allied commander just months before Eisenhower's death. John Lennon and Yoko Ono posed beside the Austin Maxey Lennon crashed in Scotland on July 1, 1969. Yoko, her daughter Kyoko, and Lennon's son Julian were all in the car, but everyone survived the ditch crash. Ernest Hemingway holds a Thompson submachine gun on his yacht Pilar in 1935. The photo stands out because he was already one of the most famous writers in the world, yet much of his life at sea looked as intense as the stories he wrote. According to the caption, this 1961 photo shows a captive man calmly hanging laundry on the bars of his cell. The image became striking for the harsh contrast between an ordinary routine and one of the most infamous trials of the 20th century. A class of women physiotherapy students trains in the Mensendiek system in the 1950s, a method built on posture, balance, and controlled movement. The scene feels striking because this strict body training was once taught as a modern science of health in classrooms like this. A radio operator works a Morse key beside a teletype machine in 1963, when messages could travel across the world through sound, timing, and paper. The setup looks simple now, but stations like this helped turn amateur radio into one of the earliest global person-to-person networks. Al Pacino appears here as a baby with his parents, Salvatore and Rose, in 1940. The photo feels special because it shows one of cinema's future legends at the very start, long before The Godfather turned him into a global star. Ron Greenwood rides the London Underground with the Football Association Cup after West Ham's win in May 1964. The moment feels unforgettable because one of football's biggest prizes is being carried home like ordinary luggage after a Wembley triumph. This photo shows Catherine McHale Slaughterback, remembered as Rattlesnake Kate, after the 1925 fight that made her famous. According to the story, she faced about 140 rattlesnakes with only 3 bullets and a no-hunting sign. Adolf Eichmann is led with covered eyes toward an El Al plane in 1960 during the secret transfer that brought him to Israel. The photo feels unreal because one of the 20th century's most notorious fugitives is shown in a quiet. This 1949 photo shows the Poses adhesive brassiere, a short-lived invention by entrepreneur Charles L. Langs. It stands out because it tried to sell a bold new idea of fashion freedom, but the design looked so unusual that it never caught on widely. Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton walked through the street around 1970 in outfits that were impossible to ignore. The photo feels so vivid because they were one of the most watched couples in the world. This photo shows the Mirabal sisters, known as Las Mariposas, shortly before their deaths in 1960, after they kept resisting Rafael Trujillo's rule in the Dominican Republic. The image hits hard because these 3 sisters later became a global symbol of courage. This 1926 police photo shows members of Detroit's Purple Gang, a bootlegging crew that became one of the city's most feared underworld groups during Prohibition. The image feels chilling because these young men helped control alcohol routes, cash. Sophia Loren rests her feet after touring the Kremlin in 1969, turning a glamorous visit into a rare, unguarded moment. The photo stands out because one of the world's biggest film stars looks suddenly human and tired beside one of the Soviet Union's most powerful landmarks. David Hoffman captured this Whitechapel building in 1973, covered with a huge message about empty homes and rising homelessness. The photo hits because it turns one block of London into a direct public accusation that still feels painfully current. Josephine Baker sits outside her chateau in 1969 after losing it to foreclosure, refusing to leave even in the rain. The photo feels unforgettable because one of the most famous performers in the world is shown fighting to hold on to the home she had filled with her adopted children. Dennis Hopper and Michelle Phillips embraced during their honeymoon on November 2nd, 1970, just 2 days into a marriage that would last only 8 days. The photo feels so striking because it captures a tender moment inside one of Hollywood's shortest. This 1965 Oak Ridge design shows stacked hanging chairs created to fit more sleepers into a tiny fallout shelter space. The image is so striking because it turns Cold War survival planning into something that looks almost unreal today. Bridget Hitler says goodbye to her son, William Patrick Hitler, in New York in 1944 after he joined the United States Navy. The moment feels almost unbelievable because Adolf Hitler's own nephew publicly turned against him and later served in the American war effort. Nubar Gulbenkian strolls by the Ritz in 1967 looking exactly like the kind of man people would stop and stare at. The photo feels so rich in detail because he was famous for turning extreme wealth into spectacle. Keith Moon poses with his daughter among a yard full of cars at his home in Chertsey in 1973. The photo feels so vivid because The Who's wildest drummer is shown in a surprisingly ordinary family moment, surrounded by the machines he loved. Louise Fletcher relaxes between scenes on the set of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975, showing a side of her that looked nothing like Nurse Ratched. Oswald Mosley stands with a bandaged head after a failed rally in Liverpool on October 10, 1937. The photo is striking because it captures how fiercely many people in Britain rejected his fascist movement in the streets. This 1946 photo by Ed Clark for Life shows a Ku Klux Klan initiation in Georgia, with robed members gathered in a nighttime ritual. The image is chilling because it captures how this white supremacist group used spectacle, secrecy, and fear to project power in public. Martin Luther King Jr. rests in Harlem Hospital on September 21, 1958, after emergency surgery saved his life. The photo feels almost unreal because doctors said the blade had come so close to his aorta that even a small movement could have been fatal. In order not to miss the daily selection of historical photos, subscribe to my channel and also write in the comments which photos you liked the most. Thanks for watching.